everyone. My name is Mehlaka Samdani. Welcome to another edition of Window to Islam, a program series that seeks to improve understanding of Islam and of Muslims here in Western Massachusetts. We ended our last conversation with introducing the meaning of the term Sharia or Islamic law. Today we will elaborate further on this concept and try and address the many apprehensions and concerns people might have about Sharia. To help us understand the nuances of this concept, we are joined today by Dr. Khan. Dr. Muqtedar Khan is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware, where he founded the university's Islamic Studies program, serving as its first director from 2007 to 2010. His research interests include politics of the Middle East and South Asia, political Islam, Islamic political thought, and American foreign policy in the Muslim world. He is the author of several books: American Muslims, Bridging Faith and Freedom, Jihad for Jerusalem, Identity and Strategy in International Relations, Islamic Democratic Discourse, and Debating Moderate Islam, The Geopolitics of Islam and the West. Dr. Khan also maintains two blogs, www.ijtihad.org on Islam and American Muslims, and glocali.org on global affairs. Dr. Khan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we'll start with the very basics. In very simple terms, could you explain what Sharia is?
Well, Sharia has many meanings to it. The literal meaning of the term really is pathway to a place where you can drink water. It's the way, it's the path. In a more profound sense, it is the way of Islam in that sense. But increasingly the term is used to indicate what we would otherwise describe as Islamic law or divine law. But often people tend to misunderstand the Sharia by equating it to what is known in the Sharia as had punishments, where you cut off hands for theft and sometimes stone people for committing adultery, even though that's not part of the had. We see that as Sharia. But Sharia is much broader than that. For example, all issues which are immanent or mundane and all issues in the faith which are also transcendent are part of the Sharia. So for example, if we were to ban the Sharia, then Muslims will not be able to believe that there is only one God, because the belief in one God is also part of the Sharia. So a lot of the elements of Islamic belief are also included in the Sharia. But broadly, there are two elements to the Sharia. One is essentially what we call as the fiqh, or the body of interpretations of Islamic sources, which are like a large body of laws, really. How to share wealth, how the inheritance should be divided, what are the processes of getting married and divorced, etc. So that's called the fiqh. And then there are rules for derivation of these laws from the sources, which is called as usul al-fiqh. So basically, Sharia is composed of those two things. What are the rules of derivation of laws, and what are these laws?
I see. So, and what are the sources? You mentioned the sources of the Sharia. Could you elaborate on what those are?
If you were to take an Islamic studies class, what we would say is that there are broadly four sources. Four sources include the Quran is the primary source. So what we do is when we try to understand an Islamic legal position on some issue, we would always first approach the Quran. And if we are unable to find it in the Quran, then we look at prophetic traditions called the Hadith literature, which is a surrogate for the Sunnah of the Prophet. Sometimes we may find it in the Quran, but it needs further elaboration, and we will still go to the Hadith literature. But the third source beyond this is considered as ijma, or consensus. Now, it could be the consensus of the companions of the Prophet, or very broadly, consensus of Muslim scholars. And then we would, if we can't find in these sources, then even though we call it a source, it's actually a process called ijtihad, where we exercise independent reasoning within the boundaries of Islamic sources. And so, for example, if someone were to ask, can a Muslim smoke marijuana? Well, the Prophet, peace be upon him, had nothing to say about marijuana, and neither does the Quran. So, and neither did the early Muslims. We don't know whether there is a consensus against marijuana or not. So you would conduct an independent thinking exercise and say, well, look at the Quran, it forbids intoxicants, and marijuana is intoxicating, and therefore it is also forbidden for Muslims. That is a process of ijtihad. But then there are other sources of Islamic law which in practical terms have tremendous significance, like maslaha, which is public interest, and also darura, which is necessity. So many laws are simply articulated because they are a necessity for society or they are in the public interest. So Islamic Sharia has many sources. Interestingly, often overlooked is the fact that urf or culture of the society is also a source of Islamic law. So there are many more besides the 4 primary sources that I suggested.
And that is considered a legitimate source of law?
Yes, it is a
cultural
legitimate
practice.
Like, for example, you could make an argument that because, like Hajj, for example, was practiced before Islam too. It was the urf or the culture of pre-Islamic Arabs. And it was included in Islamic Sharia. It's one of the 5 pillars with certain modifications to the Hajj.
And Hajj is, for the benefit of our audience, is the pilgrimage.
Pilgrimage to Mecca, which Muslims who can afford have to do at least once in their lifetime. So you could argue that Thanksgiving, for example, is the urf of this land, a culture of this practice, and it can become part of Muslim practice too.
Sure. And now, Sharia, is it, or also the way of engaging with the Sharia, can only scholars engage in independent reasoning or engage with the sources of Islamic law in trying to derive rulings from it?
Islamic legal precedence is very much like the United States. You don't have to be a lawyer to defend yourself in court. Right? In the US, you can do it. So the same way, you don't have to be an Islamic scholar to interpret Islamic law. But like every lawyer will advise you to get a lawyer if you have to go to court, God forbid, because you need to know the entire body of law. You don't even know the procedures of the court, you will do yourself harm.
Sure.
So similarly, while in technicality, all Muslims have the right to interpret laws, and understand the Quran, it becomes very difficult if they don't know where to begin with.
Sure.
So it is often advisable that Muslims become part of a legal tradition. Islamic law, unlike most legal tradition, is very pluralistic. So there are many schools of law which sometimes have contradictory or different interpretations of the law. And while we recognize the difference of the interpretation, we also recognize the validity of all of these laws. So it is advised that lay people become part of one of these legal traditions. So the work is already done for them, and they don't have to spend every day of their life researching their every step.
Sure.
Yeah.
And when was this body of law actually developed? You said that the work has already been done for them. When was it developed, and is it a fixed body of law?
It began with Islam itself, and but the complexity obviously grew over time. For example, if you were a Muslim living at the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you had only one source of law. Anything you wanted to know, you would go and ask the Prophet himself, and he would say, well, this is in the Quran, or he would give his own opinion or understanding. And some Muslims argue that even his own personal understandings were things that Archangel Gabriel taught him. So they may not be in the Quran, but they are also divinely taught to the Prophet. But after the death of the Prophet, then you suddenly had to go and ask his companions. So a new source of understanding of Islamic law began. So we started looking at how did the companions understand the prophetic teaching. So as time went by, we started adding, for example, a body of different interpretations of laws emerged. And then someone said we needed to systematize this. So Imam Shafi'i came up, who's kind of the founder of Islamic jurisprudence. So they started identifying rules. Often these rules are then authenticated through traditions from the Quran or from the Hadith literature. But over a period of time, we have had enormous amounts of schools of law in different ways of interpreting, which has developed over time. And then because of darura, as new things confront the community, new laws have been articulated. For To give you an example, there are people who are now living in Alaska who probably have to fast for 22 hours a day in the month of Ramadan, when the Ramadan is in summers, right?
Sure.
It kind of makes life very difficult for them. So there are new rules that have been added to the Sharia, which there are different interpretations. One of them is to follow the timings of the nearest Muslim country, for example.
Sure.
So yes, that particular rule did not exist until Muslims moved into these places. So the law is still evolving. Of course, the advent of modernity posed many challenges to the traditional understanding of Islam. With the growth of human rights literature, the feminist movement, which has advocated gender equality, and so on and so forth. And on some of these issues, Muslim scholars have not kept pace with time, so to speak. So while there are new ways of understanding Islam which are being advanced, they have not reached the stage where there is broad consensus among scholars as well as the Muslim community on issues of, say, gender equality or democracy or religious pluralism.
Sure. And so, when we sort of look around the world right now, the Muslim world seems to be in a bit of a turmoil. You look at ISIS, you look at Boko Haram, sort of extremist ideologies emerging all over the place. And they also profess to be adhering to the Sharia. And so how would you explain that? And how would you explain their approach to religion?
There is a streak of extremism which has existed in Islamic history for a long time. Sometimes Muslim scholars refer to groups such as Al-Qaeda and now ISIS and Boko Haram as the Khawarij, the new Khawarij. So we did have groups in the past at the time of the rightly guided caliphs who were very extremist in their interpretations. Sometimes what happens is that they are very literalist in the text and do not allow for compassion on issues because of the context of the situation. But there is more to the emergence of groups such as ISIS and Boko Haram and others which have nothing to do with Islam or the Sharia. They're responding to socio-political conditions, the failure of modernity to deliver everything that it promised, prosperity, equality, harmony. So Muslims feel marginalized. Muslim countries, Iraq was invaded by the United States on false pretext. No justice has been done. The invaders have not paid any penalty, so there are lots of people who are frustrated. But not only that there was an invasion, but the country was destabilized. And as a consequence of that, all of these demons have been unleashed. Literally, the Pandora's box was burst open. So there are lots of other reasons why. The concern for Muslims should be that, that these groups legitimize their extremist political activities using Islam. So for Muslim thinkers and Muslim intellectuals and legal scholars, it should be a source of concern that the way Islam is understood today is amenable to these kind of extremist interpretations. So for example, people are very hesitant. If you notice, even after 9/11, there was no major impetus from Muslim scholars to declare everybody in Al-Qaeda and their supporters as non-Muslims.
Right.
They just condemned those specific acts, but did not say that your belief is extremist. Because from a theological perspective, they share beliefs which are dominant in many countries in the Middle East. So this Salafi jihadi combination of Islamic interpretation can be very intolerant. It is intolerant towards other communities which are not Muslim. They're also very intolerant of different interpretations of Islam within Muslim communities. So they say our interpretation is correct to the exclusion of others. And they feel empowered to use violence to justify their interpretation, not only justify it, but impose it on others, which in itself is very un-Islamic to begin with. And oftentimes, many of these people and their founders are not really very educated. They're not scholars of Islam. And their first choice of engagement is violence, so there is no dialogue. Like, I cannot sit down and have a debate with the leader of Boko Haram to try and convince him that his understanding of Islam is fallacious, misleading, and anti-Islamic.
Great, thank you. And Since 9/11, though, and it's been quite a few years now, do you think there has been some impetus for reform within the Muslim world in terms of sort of re-engaging with the scripture, re-engaging with the text in ways that are perhaps more compatible with life today?
Well, there has definitely been changes in the way Muslims do politics. For example, immediately after 9/11, there was a lot of hesitation within the community to condemn. The tendency seems to be to resort to conspiracy theories and say these are not Muslims. And even now, in some circles, America is responsible for everything, or Jews are, or Israelis. They created ISIS, they did this. But nevertheless, if you find that Muslims now in very large numbers everywhere condemn ISIS, scholars, bodies, institutions, and Muslims have understood that it is very important to stand up and condemn these fringe groups which use Islam. And so the phrase often used now by Muslims is that Islam is being hijacked. And so there are lots of people. Only today or yesterday, a group of Sunni Islamic scholars in Iraq issued a fatwa saying ISIS is un-Islamic.
Right.
So you do see that there is significant change in the way Muslims go about doing their political business. Now the issue of reform of Islamic understanding, now that is very complicated. Muslims by definition assume that their religion is perfect.
Right.
And there are sources in the religion itself which said that religion is perfect. So the idea of reforming is repugnant to most Orthodox Muslims. But those who are calling for reform are arguing that not that the religion is imperfect, but the current understanding of the faith is anachronistic, which means it is not consistent with the time and place that we are living. And therefore, it is time for us to go back and understand the text and see, taking a fresh look at the text will suggest to you, and like on many issues, on gender issues, on issues of dealing with religious others, on many such things, you find that taking a second look gives you a new meaning at all. The world has changed significantly. Like, for example, Muslims traditionally divided the world into Darul Islam and Darul Harb, the place where Islam is practiced and the place where Islam is not. And so there was this tendency, assumption that there is war in between.
Right.
And then Muslims started living in societies which were predominantly non-Muslim, but they were not at war with Islam. So some Indian scholars came up with the word called Darul Aman, so the House of Peace, which is also a term which initially was being used for the US. But when you do research, like for example, all Muslim countries are now part of the United Nations, which is essentially a no-war treaty.
Sure.
So if we are all part of the United Nations, in legal terms, we are all part of a no-war. So the world is a house of no war, in spite of the fact that there are wars.
Right,
but
right.
in principle, it is not. So there is no need for Muslims to be at war with non-Muslims. So if you look at the new circumstances, go back and look at Islamic sources, you can advance newer understandings and newer interpretations. A lot of Muslims who are very orthodox would be hesitant to accept this, but the same Muslims are not hesitant to accept new interpretations of Islamic sources when science seems to advance it. So when there's new scientific discovery, they will come back and say, oh, this is already in the Quran. Yes, but you didn't figure that out in 1400 years, right? So now when you accept this scientific fact and then also accept that it is also in the Quran, you are also accepting a new interpretation of the Quran.
Right.
So why can't the same thing happen in the social realm?
Sure, absolutely.
Where it is a little more difficult to convince the validity of social findings. So there is a need for development of social sciences within the context of Islamic studies, so that a lot of empirical input can go into understanding of Islam. Right now, everything is very normative.
Right, right. Is these efforts to sort of re-engage with the text and sort of interpret it progressively, are American Muslims at the forefront of that effort, or is that happening sort of around the Muslim world?
In principle, American Muslims should be at forefront of these because we enjoy a lot of freedom here, and you could come up. There are places in the Muslim world where I could be in physical danger for the things that I've said right now in this show. But I feel relatively safe to say these things. So there is a lot of safety for thought in the U.S. Plus, Muslims in North America have sufficient resources so that they can invest in research. We have of late also developed tremendous competence. There are now literally hundreds of young Muslims studying Islamic studies in various parts of the world, and they are committed to this. They have resources and they have opportunity to do this research. On some issues, American Muslims have pushed on some ideas on issues of gender, the role of women in the mosque, for example. I think American Muslims are way ahead of rest. But actually, there are Muslim scholars who are doing tremendous research in traditional Muslim countries, which is also very cutting edge. To just name one is Javed Ghamdi, Allama Javed Ghamdi of Pakistan, who unfortunately had to leave Pakistan for safety reasons, but he moved to Malaysia. He didn't move to the West. And so he is doing a lot of interesting work. And so there are Muslim scholars in traditional Muslim countries who are also advancing newer interpretations of Islam and pushing the idea of ijtihad forward. There have been many big ideas which have come out in the last few years, such as the fiqh al-aqalliyat, or the minority, it's called minority jurisprudence, to understand Sharia from the perspective of Muslims who live as minorities in non-Muslim societies. And there is another new initiative called Maqasid al-Sharia. The whole idea is to understand what the fundamental purpose behind Islamic laws are, and then to rethink these laws which are inconsistent with the purpose. For example, one of the most important purposes of Islamic law is human dignity. So how could you articulate specific rulings which contradict the main purpose of Islamic law? Like, one of the key principles of Islamic law is to save life, to protect life. Or protect religious freedoms. So that is another idea which is trying to correct some of the traditions which now seem oppressive. Sometimes what happens, we may articulate rules which at that time and place may be progressive and positive, but over a period of time, the same progressive rules can now become oppressive.
Sure.
So we have to be able to keep track of, that's why empirical sciences are necessary, to keep track of the changes in society.
Sure.
The technical term in Arabic for that is illa. The conditions are changing, so the hukum or the rule has to change. So there is a lack of empirical studies in the Muslim societies, so that is also perhaps one of the reasons why Islamic law, the progress of Islamic law has not been that dynamic as one would expect it to be. Sure. Or as it needs to be, in my opinion.
But hopefully it's changing now.
Hopefully.
And sort of coming back to Islamic law and Sharia, is there more to Islam than Sharia?
Well, it is, I think, partly a problem of Muslims themselves, where they have tended to equate Islam with Islamic law. And what that ends up doing is that it ends up equating scholars of Islamic law as scholars of Islam itself. So you reduce the whole of the faith to law. And I cannot tell you what can happen to societies which are completely run by lawyers. Can you imagine a situation where everything is controlled by lawyers? And probably that is what has happened to Islam. They are obsessed with legal rulings. But there is more to Islamic law. For example, the whole idea of the purpose of Islam is essentially to establish an increasingly stronger bond with God. The whole purpose of life is to discover God, to love God, to come closer to God. The law will tell you the things that you could do which will take you away from God. But the whole idea of focusing on God and practice, that is the main purpose. But we seem to have forgotten the broader perspective. So there are issues of Islamic mysticism, Islamic theology, understanding the nature of divine presence in our lives, focusing on the psychology of the believer. All of these aspects are constantly ignored as we obsess with rules and rules and rules. So I think that there is Islamic law is it is an important part, but a small part of Islamic faith. There is more to Islam than just Islamic law. That's why if you notice that when you listen to Muslim discourse, the word that you hear the most is Islam and Sharia, Sharia, Sharia. But you will find that the word occurs in the Quran only a handful of times, maybe less than 10 times, in all its conjugations and forms. The word Sharia doesn't occur in the Quran at all so frequently as we talk about it. But there are lots of other aspects of Islam. So we hear less of God and more of Islam in Muslim discourse. Muslims seem to be obsessed with Islam itself when we are supposed to be completely focused on God. And being God conscious, we have become very Islam conscious, but not as much as God conscious. So I think there is more to Islam, and partly because of this Muslim non-Muslim engagement, this obsession with Sharia in the media, etc. Muslims themselves have got very obsessed with Sharia. But I think it's time Muslims got back to the real purpose in life, which is to try to get closer to God.
Sure. So it's more of an internal engagement with the divine. But why do you think that is? You mentioned the media as being one of the reasons that, Muslims, especially here, are perhaps more obsessed with Sharia and rulings. But what about the geopolitical conditions? I mean, does that have something to do with it? What has caused this sort of move away from the esoteric to more external trappings of what Sharia is?
In the last 300 years, there have been various periods in Muslim history where Muslims have got obsessed with geopolitics because it is so dominating. As Western powers began to colonize the Muslim world, they became a big challenge. They not only colonized the Muslim world and undermined Muslim freedoms, but they also posed challenges to the legitimacy of Islam because the demonization of Islam began. Every time Muslims fought for independence, jihad became terrorism, and so on and so forth. And then when Muslim countries began to become independent through the decolonization process, there again geopolitics became important. And then with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the late 1970s, the geopolitics also, and then the Arab-Israeli conflict. So all of these major enduring issues have made geopolitics a predominant issue in Muslim politics. But also as a result of globalization and the emergence of social media, etc., Muslims are far more connected today. I have friends now who live in villages in Indonesia and Pakistan and even countries I've never visited in Africa. So there is an emerging global Muslim consciousness, which is unfortunately not being shaped by a mystical desire to connect with God, but because of mutual concern about what is ISIS going to do, or which country America is going to invade next, or how can we help the poor Palestinians become free. So these kind of issues are connecting Muslims across. So geopolitics has become a dominant part of Muslim consciousness. And because Muslims do not separate religion and politics, the large component of politics in their mind and in their consciousness politicizes their religion too. So Muslim understanding of Islam then begins to become very, very political. A couple of years ago, I was giving a lecture on doing beautiful things in Islam under the concept of ihsan. And I was talking about forgiveness and the importance of forgiveness. And people got very upset with me because they thought that I was saying that Palestinians should forgive Israelis. Well, they should. It's a good thing. But I had not talked about it. I was just talking about forgiveness in a very theoretical sense. But people were connecting it to geopolitics immediately because they saw me as an American. So to me, it was very difficult to be able to talk about even mystical elements of the faith without geopolitics intervening. And it was also very frightening because then I realized that Muslims are now interpreting everything that is spiritual and maybe even legal within the context of geopolitics. Sure. And therefore we are interpreting our religion from a position of inferiority in terms of culture, perspective, power. So it is probably not a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for advancing our understanding of what Sharia is, its place in Islam in general, and the geopolitical context that allows or compels Muslims to act in certain ways in certain parts of the world. We can't thank you enough for joining us today. Until the next edition of Window to Islam, your host is Mehlaka Samdani.